In a suburban house built for a family of 4, there are now 7 names on the mailbox. A retired school teacher sleeps in what used to be the dining room, behind a curtain instead of a door. Her daughter and son-in-law still occupy the master bedroom upstairs. Their 2 children share what was meant to be a guest room, and in the finished basement, their 26-year-old nephew, who moved in after a layoff 18 months ago, has turned a corner near the water heater into something resembling a bedroom. Nobody in this house is homeless. Nobody in this house would describe themselves as poor. And yet the home itself has quietly stopped functioning the way it was designed to function. It was built as a private retreat for one family at one stage of life. It is now operating as something closer to a shelter system, run not by a government agency, but by whoever happens to hold the mortgage. This is not a story about a struggling minority of American households. It is a story about a structural shift that has been building for half a century and has recently accelerated into plain sight. According to Census Bureau data analyzed by Pew Research Center, the number of Americans living in multi-generational households quadrupled between 1971 and 2021, reaching nearly 60 million people, or 18% of the entire population. In 1971, that share was 7%. The change did not happen in a single dramatic year. It happened gradually, then compounded, until what was once considered an unusual living arrangement became one of the fastest-growing categories of American housing. The obvious question is why? And the honest answer is that this is not one trend. It is 2 separate crises meeting at the same address. At one end of the household, young adults are staying home longer, or coming back after they leave, because the cost of independent living has detached itself from what an early career income can support. According to the 2024 American Community Survey, nearly a third of adults between 18 and 34, 32.5%, were living with a parent, up from the year before, and not far off the pandemic-era peak. In some states, the number is close to half. In New Jersey, it is 44%. In Connecticut, it is 41%. In California, it is 39%. These are not universally low-income states. They are, disproportionately, states where rent absorbs an unmanageable share of an entry-level paycheck. At the other end of the same household, aging parents are moving in not because they enjoy less privacy, but because the alternative, professional long-term care, has become financially unreachable for most families outside the top of the income distribution. The national median cost of an assisted living community reached $6,200 a month in 2025, $74,400 a year, according to the CareScout Cost of Care survey, the same organization that was previously known as Genworth. A private room in a nursing home now costs over $129,000 a year. Medicare, contrary to what many people assume until they need it, does not cover this. It covers short-term rehabilitative stays. It does not cover the slow, ongoing custodial care that most aging Americans eventually require. So picture the arithmetic from the middle. A household in its 40s or 50s is not simply raising children anymore. It may be raising children, watching a 20-something adult child move back into a bedroom that was supposed to become a home office, and simultaneously calculating whether it can absorb a parent who can no longer safely live alone, but cannot afford $6,000 a month for someone else to do it. This is sometimes called the sandwich generation, a phrase that has become so familiar it risks sounding abstract. It is not abstract inside the house where it is happening. It looks like a Tuesday where one adult drives a teenager to practice, picks up a prescription for a parent, answers a work email from the parking lot, and starts dinner an hour later than planned, every single week, for years, with no defined end date. The Federal Reserve's most recent survey on the economic well-being of households found that among Americans providing unpaid care for an aging or ill adult, 47% were living in a multi-generational household, compared with 29% among those without caregiving responsibilities. That is not a small gap. It means caregiving itself, not just affordability alone, is pulling families under one roof. And a 2024 survey conducted by the National Endowment for Financial Education found that in households already living multi-generationally, more than half described their financial life as worse than expected, a 15 percentage point gap above the general population surveyed the same year. These are not households that see their situation as a lifestyle choice made for convenience. Many of them see it as ground they were pushed onto. Consider a household that looks financially unremarkable from the outside. A married couple in their early 50s, combined income around $130,000 a year, a paid-down mortgage balance that still leaves a monthly payment, a car loan, and a daughter in her mid-20s working full-time but unable to save enough for a security deposit and first month's rent in the same city where her job is located. The couple's own aging parent, recently widowed, has started forgetting to take medication and had one fall in the kitchen that could have been much worse. The couple does the math on assisted living, roughly $6,000 a month, $72,000 a year, an amount that would consume more than half of their combined take-home pay. They do the math on hiring a home health aide instead, which the same cost of care data puts at close to $78,000 annually for a full schedule of hands-on assistance. Neither number fits inside a household budget that was already built around two incomes, one mortgage, and no meaningful cushion. So the parent moves in. The daughter, seeing the extra bedroom now filled, delays her own plan to move out, in part because rent has only gotten more expensive, and in part because someone now needs to be home during the day when the couple is at work. What began as one aging parent's medical vulnerability becomes, within a year, a full reorganization of three adults' financial and daily lives, none of whom set out to build this arrangement. It assembled itself, decision by reasonable decision, the way most financial pressure does. It would be inaccurate, though, to describe this only as decline. There is a genuine complication in the middle of this story that deserves to slow the narrative down rather than rush past it. Multigenerational households are not, on average, the poorest households in America. Research from Pew Research Center has found that combining incomes under one roof can actually increase financial stability for many of these families, not despite the arrangement but because of it. A grandparent providing free, trusted childcare allows a parent to keep working instead of cutting hours or leaving the workforce, which is precisely the mechanism researchers like Natasha Pilkauskas at the University of Michigan have pointed to when explaining why some multi-generational households report more, not less, financial security than comparable single-generation households nearby. And when the National Association of Realtors surveyed recent homebuyers in 2024, 36% who purchased a multi-generational home cited cost savings as their primary motivation, not desperation, but a calculated decision to pool resources on purpose. 21% of Gen X buyers and 12% of older millennials bought a home explicitly suited to multiple generations in 2025, according to the same research, and multi-generational purchases now represent a record 17% of all home purchases. So the honest reframe is this. The story is not simply that Americans have become too poor to live apart. The story is that living apart, the default assumption behind decades of American housing design, no longer functions as an automatic financial upgrade the way it once did. For much of the post-war era, moving into your own home, whatever its size, was treated as an unambiguous step toward independence and status. Today, for a meaningful share of households, staying together or coming back together is the financially rational choice, and living apart is the expensive indulgence. That is a genuine inversion. It does not mean every family sharing a roof is thriving. Many clearly are not. It means the emotional and cultural meaning of the multi-generational home has shifted out from under people faster than their assumptions about what a normal American household looks like. The picture also changes sharply depending on where you live, and averages hide most of the interesting detail. In North Dakota, only 12% of young adults live with a parent, the lowest rate in the country, a reflection of a labor market where wages have kept closer pace with a lower cost of housing. In the District of Columbia, under 13% of young adults live at home, a market where the job base is relatively stable even though rents are high. But drive from Fargo to Newark and the story reverses entirely. New Jersey's proximity to Manhattan and Connecticut's mean that a young professional can hold a genuinely good job and still find that market rate rent within a reasonable commute consumes 40, 50, sometimes 60% of take-home pay. In those states, staying with a parent past your 25th birthday is not a symptom of failure to launch. It is close to the statistical norm. Generational timing compounds this unevenly as well. A homeowner who bought in 2012 or 2015, when interest rates sat near 3%, is carrying a monthly payment that may be smaller in real terms than what a renter down the street pays for a one-bedroom apartment. That homeowner has built genuine equity and enjoys real insulation from the current housing market. A homeowner or renter who is trying to buy their first home now is negotiating against mortgage rates several points higher on a home price that never fully corrected downward, financed with a salary that has grown more slowly than either. Two households with nearly identical incomes, 10 years apart in timing, can end up in entirely different financial universes. The older one has flexibility. The younger one may not be able to leave a shared household even if they wanted to, because the numbers simply do not work. There is a second, quieter form of entrapment operating on the other side of this story, one that rarely gets discussed alongside multi-generational living, but belongs directly inside it. Homeowners who locked in low mortgage rates during the previous decade are now discovering that their equity does not translate easily into flexibility. A retired couple sitting in a four-bedroom house with a paid-off or nearly paid-off mortgage might, in an earlier era, have downsized into something smaller and simpler once the children moved out. Today, a smaller replacement home, at current interest rates and current prices, can carry a monthly cost that rivals or exceeds what they already pay, even though the home itself is smaller. Property taxes assessed on today's higher valuations add another fixed cost that keeps climbing regardless of income. Home insurance premiums, particularly in states exposed to wildfire, flood, or severe storm risk, have risen sharply enough in recent years to force some owners to shop for reduced coverage just to keep the policy affordable. Selling costs, real estate commissions, moving expenses, and the tax implications of a sale eat further into any theoretical benefit. So instead of downsizing, many of these households do the opposite. They keep the extra bedrooms. And when a grown child needs a place to land, or a widowed parent needs somewhere safer than living alone, that spare capacity, once seen as an inefficiency, becomes the asset that holds the extended family together. The house that could not be economically exchanged for a smaller one becomes, almost by default, a multi-generational shelter instead. Some families are addressing this more deliberately, through construction rather than accident, and the data on that choice is worth sitting with. Accessory dwelling units, small self-contained living spaces built onto or near an existing home, sometimes called in-law suites or granny flats, have become one of the fastest-growing categories of American home construction. National estimates put the average cost of building one at around $180,000, with a typical range from $60,000 for a modest garage conversion up to nearly $300,000 for a fully detached unit in an expensive coastal market. That is not a cost most households can absorb from savings. It usually means a home equity loan, a cash-out refinance at a higher rate than the original mortgage, or years of delayed retirement contributions redirected into construction. Families who choose this route are, in effect, trading future financial security for present-day caregiving capacity, converting retirement savings into square footage. It is a real solution for households with enough existing equity to qualify for that kind of borrowing. It solves nothing for a renter or for a homeowner without meaningful equity, which is precisely why this option tends to concentrate among households that were already relatively secure to begin with. The people who most need an alternative to displacement are frequently the people least able to finance one. Zoning law is quietly shaping this trend as well, in ways most homeowners never think about until they run into it directly. For most of the 20th century, a large share of American residential zoning was written specifically to prevent exactly this kind of arrangement, single-family zoning designed, in part, to keep one house occupied by one nuclear family and nothing more. Several states have begun loosening those restrictions over the past decade, easing permitting for accessory units precisely because policymakers have recognized that the old zoning model no longer matches how families actually need to live. But zoning reform moves at the pace of local politics, unevenly, city by city, and a family in a jurisdiction that has not updated its code may find that building a legal second unit is not simply expensive. It is not currently permitted at all, regardless of what they can afford. There is also an ordinary domestic layer to this story that rarely makes it into the statistics, but shapes daily life more than any of them. A house designed for one household's rhythm now has to accommodate three. A retired parent who wakes at 5 in the morning shares walls with a teenager who is awake until midnight. A grandparent used to running her own kitchen for 40 years now negotiates counter space and grocery preferences with a daughter-in-law who has her own habits and her own sense of ownership over a house she pays the mortgage on. Small frictions that would dissolve on their own in a short visit instead compound over months and years, because there is no scheduled end date, no flight home to look forward to, no natural moment when the arrangement resets. Holidays, once an occasion that concentrated a family's warmth into a few intense days, lose some of that specialness when the same people are present at breakfast every morning of the year. None of this is catastrophic on its own. It is the accumulation of dozens of small negotiations, repeated daily, that eventually becomes the defining texture of life inside these households, whether or not anyone in the family would ever describe it using the word difficult. Underneath the financial mechanics sits something harder to put a dollar figure on, which is what this arrangement does to the people living inside it day after day. Privacy, in the American cultural imagination, has long been treated as a basic marker of adulthood and dignity, not a luxury. A closed bedroom door, a kitchen you do not share with your in-laws, a living room where you can watch what you want, argue about what you want, be tired without an audience. When 3 generations share one roof out of necessity rather than choice, that privacy contracts sharply, and it contracts differently for everyone in the house. The middle generation often absorbs the heaviest psychological load, managing the needs of both the generation above and below them, while frequently having the least private space of anyone in the household, since the primary bedroom is often the last thing anyone is willing to give up. The returning adult child may feel a quiet, persistent shame at having to explain, to friends who moved into their own apartments years earlier, why they are still in their childhood bedroom at 28 or 32, even when the honest explanation has nothing to do with personal failure and everything to do with a rental market that outran their paycheck. The aging parent, meanwhile, often experiences the most complicated version of this loss, trading a lifetime of independence for a spare room in someone else's house, keenly aware that they have become, in practical terms if not in anyone's stated intention, a dependent inside a household they once might have headed themselves. Marriages absorb pressure here too, quietly and often invisibly to people outside the house. Spouses report disagreements over money more than almost any other source of marital conflict in national surveys, and multi-generational living multiplies the number of financial decisions that used to be private between 2 people into decisions now negotiated among 3 or 4 adults with different incomes, different habits, and different assumptions about who owes what to whom. Who pays for groceries when a parent's Social Security check does not fully cover their share, whether a returning adult child should contribute rent, and how much, and what happens to that relationship if they cannot. Whose name is on the deed, and what that means for inheritance among siblings who did not move home and may resent, even unconsciously, that one sibling's household absorbed all of the caregiving burden. These are not hypothetical tensions. Pew's own research on multi-generational households found that among adults aged 25 to 34 living with a parent, the typical young adult contributed 22% of the household's total income, a meaningful sum, but one that still leaves the older generation carrying the majority of the financial weight in most of these homes, an imbalance that both generations are usually aware of and rarely discuss directly. There is also a specific and lonelier form of shame that surfaces among households who look, from the outside, entirely fine. A family with 2 working adults, a home in a decent school district, a car in the driveway that is only a few years old, can be one of the households quietly running a financial deficit behind that appearance, precisely because so much of what they earn is now committed to supporting people above and below them at the same time. They often feel they have no right to describe themselves as struggling, because on paper their household income sounds comfortable, and because the friends and neighbors around them cannot see the caregiving hours, the delayed dental appointments, the retirement contributions quietly reduced to make room for a parent's medication costs. This is precisely the audience for whom financial hardship has become invisible even to close friends, and in some cases even to themselves, until an unplanned expense arrives and reveals how little margin was actually there. It is worth being precise about who this affects and who it does not, because flattening every household into the same story would be dishonest. Not every multi-generational home is a story of financial strain. Many immigrant and multi-generational families, particularly among Asian, Hispanic, and Black households, have long organized housing around extended family by cultural preference as much as economic necessity, a pattern that predates the recent affordability crisis by generations and continues largely by choice today. Not every adult child who moves home is doing so out of desperation. Some are saving deliberately for a down payment, treating a temporary return as a strategic decision rather than a defeat. Not every homeowner absorbing a parent is doing so reluctantly. Caregiving, complicated as it is, also brings closeness, shared meals, grandchildren who grow up knowing a grandparent intimately rather than through occasional visits, benefits that are real even when they arrive bundled with real costs. The failure mode worth naming honestly is narrower than all multi-generational living. It is the households where this arrangement was not chosen from a menu of comfortable options, but assembled under duress, from a menu where every alternative was worse. The responses families are turning to are genuine, but each one comes with a cost that rarely gets mentioned in the same breath as the solution. Delaying retirement lets a household absorb a few more years of dual income before a parent's care becomes unmanageable, but it also means the primary earners are aging into their own eventual care needs without having fully funded a retirement of their own, effectively pushing the same unresolved problem one generation down the line rather than solving it. Reducing a career to part-time hours in order to provide caregiving directly, which women take on disproportionately according to the Federal Reserve's own data, preserves cash that would otherwise go to paid care, but it also permanently reduces lifetime earnings, Social Security credits, and retirement savings for the person who steps back, a cost that will not appear on a balance sheet until decades later. Building an accessory unit solves the space problem for families with enough home equity to finance it, but excludes renters entirely and leaves homeowners carrying new debt into years when their income may become less certain. Relocating to a lower-cost state can restore breathing room, but it also means leaving behind an existing support network, established doctors for an aging parent, and a job market the working generation may need to rebuild from scratch. None of these are failures of imagination on the part of the families making them. They are honest trade-offs inside a set of options that has narrowed on every side at once. What makes this moment different from earlier periods of American economic strain is that it is squeezing from both directions simultaneously, on the same household, often at the same time. A 25-year-old struggling to afford a first apartment and a 78-year-old struggling to afford assisted living are, in a growing number of American families, the same financial event, landing on the same set of parents or adult children in their 40s and 50s who are expected to absorb both. Previous generations of American families certainly faced hardship, certainly faced periods where children stayed home longer or parents moved in during hard times. What has changed is the durability of the arrangement. This is increasingly not a temporary bridge between two stable states, a young adult saving for 18 months, a parent recovering from surgery for a season. For a growing number of households, 3 generations under one roof is simply becoming the new resting point. The arrangement families settle into because none of the previous exits, an affordable first apartment, an affordable assisted living placement, an affordable smaller home to retire into, currently exist in reachable form. Real estate itself is beginning to register this shift, not as an aberration but as a market signal. Builders have started advertising multi-generational floor plans as a standard product line rather than a custom request. Homes with 2 primary suites, separate entrances, small kitchenettes tucked into what used to be a den, features aimed directly at buyers who are planning for a parent or an adult child from the day they sign the purchase agreement rather than reacting to it later. That is a meaningful data point on its own. An industry built for decades around selling the private, single-family retreat, as the American aspiration is now redesigning its core product around the assumption that privacy is no longer the primary thing buyers are optimizing for. Affordability, proximity to family, and shared caregiving capacity increasingly are. None of this means the multi-generational home is inherently a tragedy, and treating it that way would misread both the data and the people living inside it. What it does mean is that a specific American promise, the idea that each generation would move outward into its own independent household, more space, more privacy, more autonomy than the one before it, is no longer a guarantee available to everyone who works hard and plans responsibly. For a large and growing share of American families, the trajectory has reversed. Households are not spreading outward across more square footage as incomes rise. They are consolidating inward, not because they have given up, but because consolidation has become, for many of them, the only version of stability still within reach. The house at the beginning of this story, with 7 names on the mailbox, was not built to hold 3 generations. Almost no house in America was. It was built on an assumption, quietly embedded into the blueprints of post-war suburban development, that each new generation would eventually move on and build a version of the same house somewhere else. That assumption held for a long time. It is not holding now, not because families stopped valuing independence, but because independence itself became a line item that no longer fits inside an ordinary paycheck at either end of a person's life. The question this leaves behind is not whether families can adapt, because clearly they already are, room by room, mortgage refinance by mortgage refinance, curtain by curtain hung in place of a door. The real question is, What happens to a country's idea of a normal life once the home that was supposed to represent a rival quietly becomes, for millions of families, the last place still standing?